All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about something that you're going to see all the time as a Java developer, really kind of no matter what you're working on. But especially, I think if you're heading into a technical interview for, let's say, like a senior software engineer role,
Yeah.
arrays and array lists.
Two of the real fundamental concepts in Java.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of those things that you use so often. It's good to really have a solid understanding of what's going on.
Deep dive, right?
Yeah, under the hood. What are the trade-offs? What are the differences between them? Why does it even matter?
Yeah. Why should you care about one versus the other, and when might you choose one versus the other? All really, really important questions, especially when, like you're saying, you get into these higher level discussions,
right?
Where you really need to show that you understand the nuances.
Exactly.
So let's start with arrays. I guess, like at the most basic level, what's an array?
So an array in Java is just a way to collect a bunch of items of the same type.
Okay.
Right. So, you can have an array of integers, so int, or an array of strings, so string.
Right.
And the type that you declare there, that's what you're stuck with. So if you have an array of ints, you can only put ints in there. You can't mix and match different types within a single array.
Got it. So how would you actually go about, in code, creating one of these arrays?
So there's a couple of ways. You can start by just declaring a variable. So you could say, for example, string names.
Okay.
And that just said, okay, names is going to refer to an array of strings.
Okay.
But it doesn't actually create the array in memory.
Got it. So that's just the declaration part.
That's just the declaration. And then to actually allocate the memory for the array, you use the new operator. So you would say names in new string 100.
Okay. So that size in the square brackets, that's the fixed size, right?
Exactly. You're saying, I want an array that can hold exactly 100 strings.
Got it.
And that's it.
And it cannot grow. Right. It's just fixed at that.
You got it.
Okay.
And just for brevity, you can actually combine that declaration and initialization on a single line. So you could just say string names, it will new string 100.
Okay. Cool. And so now you have this array. How do you actually get at like individual items in the array?
So arrays are indexed. They're zero-based indexed, which means that the first element is at index 0, the second element is at index 1, and so on.
Okay.
So if you have an array of 100 elements,
right,
the last element is going to be index 99.
Okay. And we all know, of course, if you go outside of those boundaries, you're going to get that, array index out of bounds exception.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You don't want to do that. And it's, if you're reviewing somebody's code and you see a potential array index out of bounds exception there, that's definitely something to flag because that can cause your program to crash.
Big time. Yeah, that's not good. Okay, so I guess once you've created an array, is there like a way to determine how big it is, like what its capacity is?
Yes. Every array in Java has a built-in field. It's called length.
Okay.
And it's final. And so you can just access that with the dot operator. So if you say names.length, that'll give you 100 in this case.
Got it. So you could use that, like, let's say you wanted to, like, initialize all those strings to an empty string. You could use a for loop and just iterate through.
Yeah, you could say for int I0, inames.length, I plus name.
Perfect. Exactly. Yep. Okay, cool. Now, is there anything else kind of about how arrays are defined that we should cover, or are we good there?
The only other thing is that, you might see some older C-style syntax for declaring arrays.
Yep.
So, you might see something like int numbers.
Yeah.
And that's still valid Java code, but it's generally considered to be not as readable.
And not as modern.
Less conventional, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. So let's say now we've created this array. Do those elements, when you initially create the array with new, do they have default values or are they just completely empty?
Yeah, they do have default values.
Okay.
So if you have an array of a numeric type, int, long, short, byte, or even char, the default value is going to be 0.
Okay.
For Booleans, the default value is false.
Okay.
And for objects, the default value is null.
Okay. And that one can bite you if you're not careful, right? Like if you have an array of, I don't know, big integer objects, exactly, you just create the array.
Right.
You haven't actually created the object.
You're going to have to loop through that array and explicitly create each of the objects.
Yeah. If you just try to use it right away, boom, null pointer exception.
Exactly.
Okay. So, what if, like up front, the values that you want to put into the array? So if you know the values, there's a really nice brace syntax for initializing arrays.
Oh, yeah.
So you could say something like int primes each leaves 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13.
Okay.
And that'll create an array of those 6 prime numbers.
Got it. And I see you don't need to use the new keyword or the size.
Nope, the compiler's just smart enough to figure that out for you.
Very cool. And I also recall that you can have like a trailing comma after the last element.
You can. It doesn't make a difference.
Is there any reason for that, or is that just like a stylistic thing?
It's mostly stylistic. I mean, it can make it a little bit easier if you're like adding or removing elements. You don't have to worry about adding or removing the comma as well.
Got it. Okay. And so let's say you have an existing array variable.
Right.
Can you use a similar syntax to like assign a totally new array to it?
You can. It's a little bit different, but you can say something like, primes new int 17, 19, 23, 29, 31. And now primes refers to a different array.
Got it.
With those 5 prime numbers in it.
So you do need that new keyword this time.
You do need the new keyword because you're actually creating a new array object.
Okay, that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
Now, what about zero length arrays? I feel like those are kind of counterintuitive. Like, when would you ever use an array with 0 elements?
Yeah, so zero length arrays are interesting. You might have a method that's supposed to return an array of some things, and maybe there's no things to return.
Yeah.
So instead of returning null, which can cause, a null pointer exception down the sign, you could just return an empty array.
Okay.
So you could either say new entire, or you could just do an empty brace initializer.
Okay. And why is that considered better practice than returning null?
Because then whoever's calling that method, they don't have to worry about like checking for null. They can just like loop through the array, and the loop won't do anything because it's empty.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. All right, so we've talked a bunch about arrays. Let's move on to array lists. So, even the name kind of suggests that they're a little bit more flexible than arrays.
Yeah, so the big limitation with arrays is that they're fixed size. Once you create an array, you can't make it bigger or smaller.
Got it.
And so ArrayList is a class in the java.util package that basically manages an array under the hood.
Okay.
But it handles resizing that array for you.
Okay, so it can grow and shrink.
Exactly. So you don't have to worry about, if I have 100 things, I need to create an array of size 100. You can just keep adding things to the array list, and it'll take care of making sure there's enough space.
Very cool. And so syntactically, like how do you go about working with an array list? Like, how different is it from an array?
So the syntax is pretty different. Arrays use that kind of low-level syntax with the brackets.
Right.
ArrayList is a class, so you're going to be using, a constructor and calling methods on it. And ArrayList is also what's called a generic class.
Oh, yeah.
And so what that means is that you can specify the type of elements that the array list is going to hold using these angle brackets.
Right. So I've seen that, like array list and then string, for example.
Exactly.
And so what is the purpose of that?
So it's basically saying this array list can only hold strings.
Okay.
And so if you try to put like an integer in there, the compiler is going to complain, saying, no, that's not allowed.
So it's like type safety.
It's type safety at compile time, which is really nice.
Okay, very cool. And so how would you actually go about, declaring and creating an array list of strings?
So there's a few different ways you could do it. You could say array list string friends, new array list string.
Right.
Or, since Java 7, there's this diamond operator.
Right.
So you can just say array list string friends, new array list.
Okay.
And the compiler will infer the type. And then with Java 10, you can use local variable type inference and just say var friends equals new array list string. Okay. And that'll all do the same thing.
Cool. I've definitely seen that diamond operator used a lot.
Yeah, it just makes the code a little bit less verbose.
Yeah, it's a little cleaner. So so when you create an array list like that, does it have like an initial size or capacity, or is it just like an empty list at that point?
So unlike an array where you have to specify the size, an array list has a capacity, and the default capacity is usually 10.
Okay.
But the size, the number of elements in the list is 0.
Okay, got it. And so you don't have to worry about managing that capacity yourself?
Nope, the array list will automatically resize itself as you add elements.
Got it. So how do you actually go about adding elements to an array list?
So there's an add method. So
Right.
you would say like friends.addPeter.
Okay.
Then that would add the string Peter
Yeah.
to the end of the list.
Okay. Um, is there a way to like initialize an array list with some values at the time of creation, kind of like that brace syntax that we saw with arrays?
So unfortunately, there's no like direct equivalent of that brief syntax.
Okay.
But a common pattern is to use the list.of method,
Okay.
which will create an immutable list.
Right.
And then you can pass that to the ArrayList constructor.
Okay.
So you could say like var friends new ArrayList list.of Peter.
Got it. Okay, cool. That's a good workaround there.
Yeah.
And what if you need to like add or remove elements at like a particular spot in the list, not just at the end?
Yeah, so ArrayList has methods for that as well.
Okay.
You can use the add method,
Okay.
and you just give it the index where you want to add the element, and
Yeah.
then the element itself.
Got it.
And the element that was at that index and everything after it will get shifted over.
Okay.
And then to remove an element, there's a remove method.
Okay.
And again, you just give it the index of the element you want to remove.
Got it. And I imagine, doing that, if you're working with a really huge array list like that could take some time because you got to shift all those things around.
Yeah, you got to be a little bit careful about the performance implications,
Right.
especially if you're doing a lot of insertions and deletions in the middle of the list.
Okay, got it. So how do you actually access or modify elements in an array list? Is it the same bracket notation like with arrays?
No, it's a little bit different. You use the get method to retrieve an element.
Okay.
So you would say like friends.get 0 to get the first element.
Okay.
And then to modify an element, you use the set method. So you would say like friends.set1 Mary.
Got it. So get to retrieve, set to modify.
Exactly.
Okay. And how do you find out how many elements are currently in the array list? Is it the dot length property like with arrays?
No, it's the size method.
Okay, so size for array list, dot length for arrays.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. And how would you go through, all the elements in an array list?
So you can use a for loop just like you would with an array.
Okay.
You just use the size method to get the upper bound of the loop, and then you use the get method to access the element at each index.
Got it. Got it. Cool. Okay. So we've kind of gone through all the mechanics of arrays and array lists. For anybody who's prepping for those senior level interviews, like it's not just enough to know how these things work.
Right.
It's also really important to understand like when and why
Exactly.
you might choose one versus the other. So can we
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the big difference is that arrays are fixed size and array lists are dynamic.
Right.
So that right there kind of drives a lot of the decisions about when you might use one versus the other. If you know how many elements you're going to have up front,
Right.
an array might be a better choice.
Yeah.
If you don't know, then an array list might be a better choice. Syntactically, they're pretty different, as we've seen.
Right.
And then there's also some performance considerations.
Yeah. Let's talk about that. Like, what are the trade-offs there?
So with arrays, because the size is fixed, the memory allocation is pretty straightforward.
Yep.
With an array list, it has to resize itself sometimes.
Right.
And so what it usually does is it creates a new array that's bigger, copies everything over,
Okay.
and then continues on.
Right.
And so that resizing can be a performance hit
Right.
if it has to happen a lot.
Yeah. Especially if you have a really huge array list
Right.
and it's got to resize.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's going to take a bit of time.
Yeah.
And then in terms of like actually accessing the elements, are there differences there?
Yeah. So for accessing elements by index, arrays are generally a little bit faster because it's just direct memory access.
Okay.
With an array list, there's a method call involved.
Right.
So there's a little bit of overhead there.
Got it. Okay.
But, on the other hand, if you're doing insertions and deletions in the middle of the collection,
Right.
sometimes an array list can be faster because it's handling all that shifting for you.
Right.
Whereas with an array, you would have to do that yourself.
Got it. So it really does come down to understanding like, okay, what's the use case?
Right.
Okay. If you've got something where, you know the size and it's fixed and you need the absolute best performance, an array is probably the way to go.
Right.
But if you need something more dynamic,
Right.
you don't know the size, then the array list is probably a better bet, even if there is a little bit of performance overhead.
Exactly.
Okay.
And being able to discuss that kind of stuff in an interview, like that's what's going to set you apart as a senior engineer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Showing that you understand those trade-offs and not just like the syntax of, how to use them. Okay, cool. So just to kind of wrap things up here, we've covered arrays. They're fixed size, potentially faster direct access.
Yep.
But, you don't have that dynamic resizing. Array lists are dynamic, a little bit more of an object-oriented interface.
Right.
But you might have that performance hit with the resizing and
Right.
the method calls. So, both are fundamental parts of Java.
Absolutely.
And understanding those differences is key.
Yep. And even beyond just like answering interview questions, understanding these things will help you make better decisions about how to design and write software
Oh, yeah.
in your everyday work.
Absolutely. Cool. All right. So this has been a really great deep dive. I think, especially for anybody who's getting ready for those senior interviews,
Right.
this has been super helpful.
Yeah.
Just a final thought for our listeners as you're continuing to prep.
Yeah.
Think back to projects that you've worked on where you had to make these kinds of decisions. Why did you choose an array versus an array list? Were there any performance issues that you ran into?
Right.
Really thinking about that is going to solidify your understanding
Absolutely.
and also give you some really good examples to talk about in the interview.
Yeah. The best examples are the ones from your own experience.
Exactly. Exactly. All right, cool. Well, thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.